Thank you very much, Ben, for this very kind introduction. And thank you for inviting me, and thank you everybody for coming. So it's a great pleasure, but a lot of responsibility to do that as well. But of course, I would like to start with a sort of disclaimer that this is not a real paper. Unfortunately, there is not much new material here that I could find over this year. I, like all of you, although I'm a librarian myself, I didn't have access to any resources unless they're digitized. So, and I kind of decided to present this paper as not a kind of research paper, but a kind of reflections. Maybe some of you might find some facts that you didn't know, but because they're not because they're not unknown, but because they might be put in a different context. So, and I must admit, I would really like participation as much as possible, so I can actually stop and cut myself if there is a good discussion, because what I was trying to present, as I said, are my thoughts and reflections how we might proceed, and it is actually a bit of an experiment on my part, but we're all kind of adapting to new ways of working, I guess. So I start with explaining the drivers for this experiment. Over the past quite a number of years, I was working on producing publication and commentary to the correspondence between two Russian writers, Mark Aldanov and Ivan Bunin. And probably Ivan Bunin is not someone who needs a lot of introduction. He was the first Russian Nobel Prize laureate in 1933. But obviously Mark Aldanov needs a bit of an introduction, and I will do it during my presentation because it will be centered around Mark Aldanov. So his papers, his letters to Bunin are held at the Edinburgh University Special Collections. And this is quite interesting because in itself, because these letters found their way to the Edinburgh Special Collections because of the academic connections. But this is the only papers, the only part of his archive that survived, because all the rest of the papers didn't survive the war. The second bit of work I was doing is my article on diaspora and immigrant publications and publishing, where it is more sort of kind of information science type of research, where I was trying to understand the landscape of publishing and the definition, what we are collecting, whether it's diaspora, whether it's community, whether it's like Russian language, just published, anything Russian language. So my question was, what are we collecting? Why are we collecting? What is the history? Where we're going further? And linking to that is a kind of absolutely non-academic thing, is the collection development strategy paper that I have to write, where part of it would be obviously our audiences, and our audiences as you, academics and people who are interested in Russian studies, but also the Russians who might use the collections and who produce their collection items. So basically, this is the drivers. Then I had two ideas also. First, to check how creating social networks, visualization and data for them can help with these tasks. So we all know that a lot of material have been collected and a lot of work have been done within this group and by the members of this group and wider Anglo-Russian research community, and many links were unveiled and discussed in various aspects. But the main aspects were the influence of the Russian culture and vice versa, and the Russian presence in the UK. So, but as you can see, my questions were slightly different. And secondly, again, with my librarian's hat on, I was wondering how to incorporate the resources and my knowledge about the resource, and not only my knowledge, but you know, our knowledge about the resources into the picture and the data as well. Because, for example, how to link personal records to the known resources about them. Of course, I mean mainly archives and manuscripts, but rare publications as well, because obviously my day-to-day job is to receive and answer inquiries from people. Where can I access, where can I get this and that material? So I came up with, and I started reading about social networks and the structure and how we analyze social networks. And I don't want to bore you to death. So I'll just try to open the presentation. So that, can you see it? Yeah. So that was the slide meant to be, the slide meant to kind of show the my puzzlement with the collections here. So, for example, mechaniczny transport, something that I was always kind of surprised to see. Am I making it slightly smaller? Yeah. Surprised to see in the collections. And this poster that I found in the Leeds Russian archive, where the Russian academic group is inviting members to their event on Leo Tolstoy. So, sorry, I'm kind of, yeah. And this is another kind of strange thing that I found recently in the archives, because just two of these items, entirely random, presented to the British Library by the collector André Sabin, and Chris Thomas, who is here in the audience, would probably know more about these items, but they resurfaced just only now. So the letter by Remizov to someone I don't really know. I haven't seen the letter, but you can see the sort of the idea behind it. So the idea of, I was wondering whether social networks as a kind of structure could help us, because we are analyzing, by analyzing and presenting social networks, we kind of present methods of analyzing the structure of the whole social entities, as well as a variety of theories explaining the patterns observed by the structure. So the social network is a theoretical construct, and it is useful for social scientists. But as we all know, we are actually going into the age of digital humanities. And this was an attempt to see what kind of data is needed, what we can put into the data to get some useful visualization in terms of digital humanities. Social network analysis is the process of investigating social structures through the use of network and graph theory. And it characterizes network structure in terms of nodes that individual actors or people or organizations, like, for example, our network or many other organizations that existed 100 years ago, but also ties and edges and links between them. And the actual research of the links as they graphically presented might give some interesting and unexpected views. It will be probably of interest to us to learn that one of the founders of this social network analysis was Anatoly Rapoport, who was an American mathematical psychologist, was born in the Russian Empire to a Jewish family. So his parents immigrated to America when he was just a boy. So visual representation of social networks is important to understand the network data and convey the results of the analysis. And now, what I would like to do, I'll just stop sharing for a moment. I'm sorry, because I stopped seeing my text when I share, and that was a bit of a mistake on my side. But anyway, so I'll just need to put it back. Yeah, so as an example, I wanted to talk about my character, Mark Aldanov. Oh, sorry, I did it wrong. Yeah, Mark Aldanov, so who was a Russian writer, and he would be quite on the periphery of what we're talking now, the Anglo-Russian networks. But because he was born in Kiev and we don't know which year, the reason we don't know, I suspect, is because we know very, very little about his youth and anything before his immigration, rather the First World War, because his great-grandfather owned quite a number of factories in Kiev, and one of these factories was the brick factory where the Baylis case actually happened. Baylis was a manager of this factory. So Aldanov's relatives, and I suspect uncle and father, were involved in this and had to flee. So that's why we know very little about his early years. But he died in Nice in 1957. But now how he was linked to Britain. He lived in Berlin, Paris, then New York, and then Nice. But his link through, to the British kind of network was through social connection, through family rather. So his cousin or sister of his wife married Alnett Haskell, and in one of his letters, Aldanov was writing to Bunin, so that my cousin actually engaged, and he's a rich Cambridge graduate. So we all know that Haskell, as a prominent specialist in ballet. And here is his portrait from the National Portrait Gallery. They have digitized a lot of their material, which is really good. And Haskell was a co-founder of Camargo Society, which is a society created and to produce ballets. But obviously, we were not going to talk about the society itself, but what is interesting and quite expected, that obviously on the board of this society were semi-retired at that time ballerina Lydia Lopukova, and she was their choreographic advisor, and of course her husband, the eminent economist John Keynes, was treasurer. So now I think quite a few people in the audience would make connections. Of course, you would immediately make links to your favorite characters who were linked to Keynes and Lopukova. And maybe some of you will also remember the Oxford professor of economics, Paul Vinogradov, and his son, historian Igor Vinogradov, whose archive is now at Leeds. And this, again, a digitized collection of his mother-in-law, Ottoline Morel, presented in on the website of the National Gallery. But we'll go back to Aldanov, who on one of the visits to London, where he normally stayed with the family of his cousin, one of the accounts of his visits was that he was writing to Bunin. There are no Russian writers in London, absolutely. By the way, Pears told me that the king reads Kuskova's articles that Pears translates for her. Apparently, the king is interested in all Russian issues, but in general, nobody knows about us in England. The people in the society, of course, tell that they have read my books, but they pretend, and not very, very convincing. But I didn't see any translations of my books or any other books of Russian writers in book shelves, on the bookshelves in shops. So here what is of interest is that he's talking about Bernard Pears as a kind of his encounter, the encounter with him is not for the first time, so he knows him well. And of course, Aldanov was really, really nervous by the kind of mid-20s about his position and the other Russian writers' position in England, because you know, the famous critic who worked with Pears and in the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, Dmitry Petrovich Topolk-Mirsky, was going through his sort of transition to the left and writing more and more about Russian contemporary literature. So if in 1925 Mirsky was kind of okay about Aldanov, at least it wasn't a very positive sort of mention, but it was nothing. There was nothing offensive. In his article in 1929, he put Aldanov below Tsvetaeva, which is probably correct. I don't know. I wouldn't. I wouldn't like to judge, but the way he did it was saying, if we're going several steps below, down below, we can talk about Aldanov. So, and of course, what Aldanov worried about what he was worrying about translations into English. But to finish with Sviatopolk Mirsky, I just wanted to say that it is probably symbolic and very interesting that some letters of Sviatopolk Mirsky are now held in the British Library, because at in the introduction to his book about contemporary Russian literature, Mirsky wrote, "The book was written in London and would not have been written without the help of the British Museum and the London Library. The British Museum is an invaluable treasure house for Russian books of the 19th century. For the period of 1900 and 1914, it is somewhat less complete, and since the outbreak of war, it has almost ceased acquiring Russian books." But he puts an asterisk and says, "Quite recently, it seems to have taken measures to renew its supply." So as a kind of, I must admit that at the British Library, at the British Museum rather, at that period, the person who was responsible for selecting Russian material was a specialist, rather linguist, and he was more interested in Czech language. So, but back to Aldanov. So Aldanov was worrying about his sort of translations and the influence that Mirsky could impose on the British society in terms of interest and the British publishers. However, we know that Aldanov was one of very, very few Russian writers who actually was translated. His first novel, the first historical novel, St. Helena, a Small Island, was translated almost immediately and into English. And here it would be interesting to see whether he had any links or connections and whether there were any recommendations given. Because in another letter he wrote, "My historical novels were translated by Alfred Edward Shemet." And then he gives his address that I just copied and pasted from the letter. And I don't know him personally, but in most of the reviews, although there were some exceptions, his translations were actually praised. So I was trying to find Shemet, but couldn't find any information on him. And if anyone knows any information, has any information, it would be really great to learn more about him. But what I did find was this picture from a digitized copy of his other translation, his translation of Leskov. And on this copy, as you can see, it says M. Shemet. And M. Shemet was Marie Shemet, his daughter, an art historian and the first woman curator at Tate, obviously after the war. And this is her portrait made in 1927 by Nadia Benoit, a mother of Peter Ustinov. So all these connections, and of course, Aldanov knew Nadia's uncle Alexandre in Paris, Alexandre Benoit in Paris. I'm not suggesting for a moment that this is a proof that these connections were sort of the most important, and that's how Aldanov got translated. But on the other hand, I think that could be a really interesting sort of look into this. So I think that probably I'll just stop with this, and probably need to say that I obviously do understand all the problems with the of this approach, and the question, of course, why do we do that? But I just want to stress that the network of interconnections is not an object of analysis, but the lenses through which a new view can be obtained. And it could be from above, from below, from side, from behind. And whether it is from top or side, it depends on the architecture, how we actually create the project. And the programs that we actually apply to do this work for us, they don't search for connections and network. They only process the data. And so they bring them into kind of readable and visualized view. So, and the kind of the analysis, the analysis of what data should be put in is entirely on the researchers. And the analysis of the network will just consist in the search of connections or their absence, because what is important is also to see the absence of connections. These visualizations might actually show us the absences, which might tell us something which probably we won't be able to see when we do a kind of narrative research like I've done now today. And also data and not the visualization can play another role. For me, what was interesting, I was thinking that the data can play the role of a catalog or a bibliography or a sort of repository of resources. So, and probably I would stop here and would welcome your opinions or more connections and more sort of discussion. I would really wanted this to be kind of discussion. And when we were talking to Ben earlier, originally we were thinking about a workshop even, but we'll see how it goes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katya. That was really fascinating. And yes, we would invite questions at this point from, well, questions and comments from the audience. If you have questions or comments, could you please post them in the chat, and Anna and I will read them out. While we wait for questions or comments to appear in the chat, Katya, if I may pose a question to you. These Anglo-Russian networks, social, professional, cultural, such as they exist in the early 20th century, is something I know less about as a mainly historian of the 19th century and very early 20th century. So I'm just wondering, while I'm chewing over what you said about data analysis and social network models and so forth. How different are these networks that you're talking about to the ones that existed in the late 19th century, I mean, socially, culturally, professionally? In particular, I'm wondering how much of a difference the emergence of a kind of professional Russian studies community around the beginning of the 20th century in Britain has made to the way that these sort of Anglo-Russian networks develop. If you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. You see, the centers of focus were completely different. So when I was talking, for example, about Prince Dmitry Svятopolk-Mirski, I think that he was sort of the most influential person at that period, but another influential person, the similar influential person, was only another prince, Prince Kropotkin. But that was the focus of that network, was the British Museum to a certain extent at that time. So while with the development of Slavonic studies, formal Slavonic studies at King's College, and then the institute formed like School of Slavonic Studies and Slavonic Studies at Liverpool during the First World War and immediately after the revolution. So the focus of the kind of academic studies shifted there. And there was, and also those who stayed, who were immigrants, before the revolution, many of them came back, and they were replaced by other people. However, in Britain, in particular, there was a pretty large cohort of people who actually came to work rather than for political reasons. And these were scientists and social scientists who stayed in the, and worked, for example, Paul Vinogradov was one of them. So he actually stayed there to work. So there were quite a few other people. And also, they started forming groups that would help new immigrants. The legal situation in Britain was completely different from other countries, but there were works written about it, so that the British government promoted assimilation, and therefore the community was pretty much assimilated. So there were a lot of elite professional people, and those, and because assimilation was promoted, so people had to choose whether they wanted to become British and stay, or they kind of wanted to still wait, because until the 1920s, they all felt it was a temporary kind of solution. So there were actually various relief committees, and in the early 20s, there were plenty of them, but some of them were short-lived. But for example, there was a group which I would probably like to mention. This is a Russian academic group. It was chaired by Professor Grinchevsky, and he was a specialist in gerontology at Oxford. So he, and then at that point, Mikhail Rostovtsev was there, and Paul Vinogradov, and Mikhail Rostovtsev was an Asian historian. So they formed, in 1920, they formed a group, this Russian academic group. Rostovtsev left very soon to America because he accepted a professorship there. But these groups started appearing in other countries, and very soon they merged, but they also, Rogatchevskaia suggested to establish an international committee for relief committee for Russian scientists, probably scholars. So, and interestingly, I didn't mention it, but that was one of the kind of puzzlements for me as well. So interestingly, the papers of this group are now held in the Russian State Archive, and one of the Russian researchers, Yegorova, she researched the archive, and she stated that by the end of the 1920s, the group had a program of cultural and educational events. And what was the most interesting for me, that they got the right to examine master dissertations and to give award master degrees. And also part of this of their program was to support Russian students. So there were multiple kind of centers, and they all were very fluid. And again, if you start talking about it in a very linear way, as I'm trying to do now, that's where it becomes difficult to put them all on the same page. Who was there? I would just, as an example, I would show you this. I will share the screen again and show you this slide. Yeah, this one. So this is an event organized slightly later in 1935. This is an event to honor Tolstoy, but I don't know how much you can see here, but it is organized in cooperation with the North Russian Association, which is a entirely different organization. So it's a kind of political organization, but it stopped being political. But they were from the kind of army during the Civil War. Then the School of Slavonic Studies, and you can see other organizations. So they were kind of all. Can you see quite a few people here? So yeah. So basically, because there were not so many of them, they were trying to work together. By the way, this was the event that the chair of the North Russian Association invited Bunin to speak at. It was in 1935, and they hoped that Bunin, as a Nobel Prize laureate, will come to London to talk. But it looks like Bunin didn't want to do it for free, so, and it didn't work out. So
that's great. And that leads on to a second question I was going to ask, but I will leave for a bit, which is about the sort of geographical hubs of these Anglo-Russian networks, because in the 19th century we sort of very much think of the British Museum and the reading room thereof, and I guess that is starting to shift somewhat in terms of where the institutions where these people meet, where they congregate, so forth. We maybe could come back to that later, but there are a couple of questions in the chat. Firstly, from Wim Goodenies, firstly asking how we promote this personalized research network. Secondly, why not study Mark Aldanov in an international context, given that he was everywhere in Europe? If you want to respond to either or both of those questions.
So how to promote this personalized network research? Why not start alternative in the international? Yeah, I totally agree. I sort of, it is just the first attempt because I was so new to it. And Aldanov really has a sort of international standing. It is a really strange, he's a really strange writer to me. So it looks like he was writing less, you know, worse, right? He had a really good start, and then probably it wasn't that good. However, what he did, he contributed to the historical novel and the development of historical novel. And I think it was really important, and it was it really resonated with the audiences. Yeah, so he was translated in 26 languages, if I'm not mistaken. So, and yeah, but having said that, his translations were also became also popular when he moved to America. So here he kind of invigorated his contacts with Knopf, and that was. I would very much like to do it if I can.
A question from Bob Henderson in the chat, who was responsible for Russian and Slavic acquisitions at the British Museum, British Library in the beginning of the 20th century.
I would just reply to that because I just don't want to. Don't want to. Oh no, I won't. I'm losing connection. Yeah. No. I will just don't want to say something stupid, but I have it on file.
A comment from Charlotte Perkis. I really appreciated the concluding remark about how networks of connections are not the object, but the lens through which we can view and then build a project. I think we'd all agree with that. Tim Blowbelt asks, is it true that Mirsky's chance meeting with E.H. Carr in Moscow in 1937 ended up being his undoing? I don't know if you can shed any light.
To be honest, I don't know. I'm not a specialist on Mirsky himself. The only thing I read the same things as you all from the book by Smith. So I wouldn't speculate. But it was whether it was sort of because of his meeting. I wouldn't think so. It was inevitable. I think it was just inevitable. From what we know about that period.
Question from Michael Holman. What role did people like Elmer Maud play in bringing together people with shared Russian interests across literature and politics?
That's what I probably won't be able to tell you right now. They were kind of, I mean, I cannot comment on, this particular. They were active within the Russian circles, but again, how active and how often that happened, and whether it was a kind of things that was happening on a regular basis. I cannot tell you. What remains of the papers is held in the British Leeds Russian Archive. Again, if Richard Davis didn't put it on the website, I
think I can add something here.
Okay, yes.
I've done some research exactly on Olmer Mode in the Leeds archive, and he was a very prolific person because he did not only translate most of Tolstoy's works and published his century translation, but he also organized Tolstoy Society, I think in 1927, in order to inspire people to somehow support his idea of translating Tolstoy's works. He also kept in touch with Bernard Pears a lot, and was one of the active members of Anglo-Russian Literary Society, which I was quite sure you, Katya, would mention, because it was one of the harbor of Anglo-Russian connections for more than 30 years in Britain. It was based in London, and it was organized in I might confuse the dates. I think 1898, something like that, by Edward Cazalet. And in 1920s, the society stopped existing, mainly because Bernard Pears founded the School of Slavic Studies and somehow overtook their responsibilities. Yes, but it was that kind of harbor where people from all over the world, from not only from Britain, but also from American, European countries and Russia as well, somehow met and exchanged the ideas about Russia. And they published the proceedings quarterly for, again, more than 30 years. And it's a very interesting source of materials, and some of the issues contain the list of members who joined the society and who already been a member for a while. And I think it's also a worth resource for just to collect the names of people who were engaged in Anglo-Russian connections, not only literary connections, of course. Although the society had the name of Anglo-Russian Literary Society, they obviously discussed not only literary issues, but also politics, economics, all sort of things. So, yeah, sorry.
This is exactly the response I, wanted to get. Thank you so much for commenting, because this is the kind of thing I would really grateful so that people can add to this.
I can see that Michael Holman's got his hand up.
A comment or two. Elmer Maud set up the Tolstoy Society certainly in order to raise money to help the publication of his centenary edition of Tolstoy, which to this date is the fullest collection of Tolstoy's works in English that we have, published in 1928 and 1936. But Aylmer Maude earlier was really very much at the center of Russian things and corresponded with all manner of people. He was an active member of the Fabians, and through the Fabians, of course, we've been connected with H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw and others. Admittedly, his interest was primarily literary, but his connection with the Tolstoyans, which goes back to the 1890s, led to the establishment of a number of societies in London, organized round their interest in Tolstoy. Now, these didn't last long, they lasted a number of years, but they did bring together people with interest in Russia. And if you're interested in Aldanov, another person who was central to links with Russia was Alexander Sirnis. Alexander Sirnis was from Latvia and worked as secretary to Chertkov in Tuckton House in Christchurch. He had Russian, he had Latvian, he had German, he had English, and he acted as a go-between for the British socialists who didn't know much about Marx. They knew more about Christian socialism. But nobody has done much work on Solanus, and I think he was at the hub of one of these networks, and the remains of his archive are also in the Leeds Russian archive. I just wanted to kind of pop that in. Unfortunately, I've got another Zoom starting in about 5 minutes, but that was very interesting what you had to say, Katya. It's difficult to know how to tie in the theory with the actual practice. The theory of your little nodules going this way and that is really what all research is about, because once you start, you set up a network like this network you've got around you now, and people have contacts in a huge number of different areas. I'm at the moment chasing up networks who might help me kind of identify specialists in Russian opera in Paris in the 1920s and 1930s. And I need a network for that because my step-grandfather sung with Shaliapin with this opera everywhere. And I'm just going through his papers at the moment. So your kind of network that you have, Ben, is absolutely essential for people like me. Now I've retired from the university. I don't have connections into the university, but I have, connections with young people like you doing this kind of research, which is very exciting. So thank you very much indeed, Tanya.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting.
Michael, thank you for that contribution. We have some comments in the chat from Claire Davison, Becky Beasley, and another comment from Charlotte Perkins addressed to Michael. I don't know if you will see that before you go.
Right, thank you. Yes.
Claire and Becky, can I invite you to address your questions to the room if your internet connections will allow?
Yes, I can try. My connection isn't great.
Thank you.
Just that listening to Katya got me thinking about actually defining the type of hub, because obviously here you're working from the British Museum, but I just thought the whole concept of whether hubs were forming around a single person or whether they were more professional, or whether there was a sort of a domestic trigger, just how they began other than, I suppose, the profession of the British Museum. And I just wondered how many of those you're finding actually had contacts before they arrived, or whether it was the exile or immigration that triggered the whole coming together as a network in the first place.
It was interesting, for example, to read Mirsky's paper, because it looks like he was actually finding his connection as he was going along. Of course, he had some, but actually, so he was really working on them. Aldanov is a different case. He actually had, he was a Mason. So his connections were in that. And to be honest, I don't know much about it. He was very secretive about it. So, but he met people in high societies. He met princes. He met, princesses. Princess Alice. He mentions granddaughter of Queen Victoria. So I had breakfast with her casually. But so, in terms of scholars, I think they have very much professional connections. And then social scientists was another hub, because I didn't see so kind of many prominent social scientists. We don't really talk about social sciences in any other context rather than British. So I think these were professional. And talking about Haskell and what happened to the family, actually we know that Francis Haskell was obviously one of the well-known British art historian, and he went to Venice Biennale and met a Russian art historian from St. Petersburg, and they met, and Larissa moved to what? Oxford. Yeah. So yeah, things can be very, very different.
Becca, did you want to?
Sure. My point, I suppose, was just about while Katya was speaking, and thank you, Katya. I really enjoyed listening to you. While you were speaking, I was thinking about where networks cross over, but where there's kind of deliberate attempts to not let groups mix. And so I suppose when I was looking at some of these groups, I was interested to see where somebody like Maud, for example, does keep popping up all over the place, even where you don't really expect him. And I think in some ways the Anglo-Russian Literary Society is quite a surprising place for him to pop up, and he's relatively unusual there. But once we move into the 20s, where a cordon sanitaire might exist between some of these groups, who's prepared to cross and who isn't, might be a kind of interesting thing to think about with your authors.
Yeah, absolutely. So the absences are very important, and I don't think we can see absences without it, right? So when we kind of research in a normal way, so we pick up facts and we pick up things that are linked, but again, we cannot, we don't normally think where they don't link.
I also wanted to add that the research on these hubs is extremely interesting in terms of how hubs can be viewed as a meeting point of different worlds, and then different worlds meet the most creative and exciting things happen, and how the existence of these hubs influenced the development of translations of Russian literature into English, and how generally Russian culture influenced British culture and vice versa. Just these influences and this creativity which was born in these hubs, I think it's just fascinating. And the research, the investigation of this phenomena is extremely interesting. Yeah, thank you for your talk, and the digital humanities approach is indeed proved to be very useful.
Yes, I certainly think that's something we can all go away with, that sort of conceptual question that Katya raised at the end about the balance to be struck here between traditional humanities scholarship and these new digital humanities approaches to this sort of scholarship. I suppose in relation to the hubs, I maybe it's an obvious point, but social and economic status also plays an important part in the connections with allegiance to a particular hub, because it at least for political emigres, it's important. I need to be part of a community, and a need to have some sort of social ties in a place where you would otherwise have none. So if you're a literary figure of some means, and you have some sort of reputation to begin with, perhaps a particular connection to a particular geographical or institutional hub is not so important. Would anybody else like to add any questions or comments? So feel free to unmute yourselves and just jump in.
Yeah, I would like to add some comments on what I wrote in the chat. what I see in historical network research, and there's lots of groups now working on it, that is very much focused on digital humanities, and as Katya was saying, really focusing on how to present it, and they juggle with graphs and statistics, but the very moment you start asking, but who actually met whom, and who was responsible for transferring this or that idea, they just refer to the to the graph or the network scheme. So Mike, and what we're doing is actually something that has been existing for ages. How can we kind of put ourselves back on the map without being obliged or without being kind of marginalized by digital humanities? So we can use digital humanities, but we want to go into personal histories, I guess.
Is it a question? I thank you very much for the comment. I kind of opened the link before it disappears in the chat, so I know that in Zoom the chat disappears. So I opened the link, so I'll have a look. Well, I don't know. I think that I look at it as a tool rather than sort of methodology in itself, right? So if any tool is useful, I want to learn how to use it. So that's the only thing, and I want to try it. So I don't think that there is a danger that you know, the whole academic community will move into this kind of all singing and dancing graphs, and but I think the more we can adapt these tools to our needs, the more flexible they become, and those people who actually created them in the first place, they had their own tasks to solve. And I think my question would be, is something that I want to see can be solved with the help of this instrument. And yeah, even this discussion actually provokes conversations, but obviously you can say this is a kind of old-fashioned way of doing things. But look at the organizations that existed at that period. There are plenty, really. But again, when you talk about them, when you teach even them, I think that's where it becomes difficult, because you have to actually put them in a kind of linear succession, right? As if you're kind of taking a three-dimensional thing and put it into 2D. But also, I think one of the main incentives is how to incorporate our knowledge of the sources into this, so that we can share our knowledge of the sources. And it is like the reason I showed you these two random documents from the British Library, right? Because I don't know who on earth would, you know, search for Remizov in the British Library. I would just say, no, we don't have any Remizov. So suddenly we get this letter. I don't know how important it is, right? To be honest, I want to see it now. But still, I think these things are happen very often. So when I was researching for this, for example, I checked whether we have any letters or anything on Lydia Lopukhova, and we do, right? And we do. It's very random, again, but I don't know whether it's extremely important or not, but it would be good to put it on the map. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know if you, replied to your question.
You did.
Charlotte Parker says, I want to know more about Lydia for sure. So that's two on that front.
To be honest, I don't know much. I just checked the catalog and I found it. So, so when I'm back, I might have a look. Yeah.
Any other questions, comments, musings, thoughts?
I have one last thought. I meant to say it before, sorry, which is just that, I mean, this was implicit in what Katya was saying anyway, but I think the archives of university Russian departments and also potentially school Russian departments are still quite an untapped source. And because in the period that you're talking about, in the kind of first half of the 20th century, it's still quite a niche world. I think that people who are teaching Russian are, they're also, of course, translating, and they are in touch with so many people. So I think that they're quite good. Those institutional hubs are very rich to explore. And I mean, I know that the Neville Forbes archive, for example, seems to have barely been looked at, and is just a kind of pile of papers in a box. But is fascinating just to see who he was connected with as one of the first Russian teachers.
Yeah, the CEES special collections, they put quite a nice list on their website. Now it's much better than it used to be.
Question from Richard Shaw. Which scholarly projects of mine, perhaps through IT gathering, very extensive sources to allow us to interrogate the material and cross-reference? A musicologist at the Open University has quite recently mined all the facts from the New Grove, enabling him to ask all manner of questions from the material gathering. Richard, are you able to expand on that? I'm not sure I know anything about musicology in this period, and I don't know who else might.
Am I? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I'm not a Russian scholar at all. I'm just doing a tiny little patchwork of research on a particular singer. But a few years back, I went along to an Open University event, and there was this guy who had found a way of searching literally all the text for the New Grove, which is a sort of standard British encyclopedia of things to do with classical music. And because of that, even though as scholars working in our tiny patches, we know perfectly well a lot of those articles are slightly inaccurate, it still allows him to ask rather broad issues about immigration of musicians, about where the leading concert venues are, all that sort of stuff. And I'm just wondering how much that sort of information gathering has been done within Russian studies. The trouble is, I take a worm's eye view of history. I'm interested in particular facts about where a particular singer was at a particular time. So I'm anxious to get the fruits of what you're all exploring.
I would say that probably we don't have enough digitized materials to mine.
Yes.
So with obviously this source of mining would have been press, but the problem with the press is that it's being digitized, but it's a very slow process, but also the OCR of newspapers takes a lot of time to clear. And quite a few digitized materials are not OCR'd. So that presents a huge problem. So I can access it, but still it's not, it doesn't present itself for any digital humanities research.
If you could encourage that to be sped up, that would be very great news.
I really would love to. I'm kind of working on the project, but it's not a digitization. Unfortunately, I cannot push any digitization of the British material in the British Library. But at least this is to collect bibliographic information on in which libraries periodicals are held. So that's what one of the PhD students who works with me is doing now.
Thank you.
Do we have any other comments or contributions from anybody? Okay, well, that being so, I think it just remains to thank Katya once again for giving such a fascinating and insightful talk, and you've given us all an awful lot to think about, both in terms of the specific social connections and networks that you talked about, and the methodological questions you raised. So thank you for that. And thank you all for coming, and for your very insightful questions and comments and contributions. A bit of housekeeping before we sign off. The next Anglo-Russian Research Network event will be on April 22nd at the same time, when we will be joined by Bob Henderson, who's of course here tonight, for a talk on his new book on Lenin in London, which I'm very excited about, and I hope you all are too. So I hope to see many of you who are here this evening here there for that as well. And yes, I think that's about all I have to say. So I'm going to stop recording this now and finish the meeting. But thank you all once again, and thank you specifically to Katya.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for your questions and for all the comments. And it's really a pleasure to be with you.